After a firefighter rescued him from the flames, the millionaire stood frozen, stunned by what he saw. A scar. The same scar his brother had, the one he'd last seen 18 years ago, the day his brother had disappeared. For Ethan Williams, the day had begun like any other, caught up in the usual whirlwind of business meetings and high-stakes negotiations. As a millionaire entrepreneur, his life was all about control. Every decision was deliberate, every move calculated, all part of a larger strategy. But standing in a towering New York City office building, Ethan had no idea that something beyond his control was about to change everything. He was in the middle of finalizing a deal when a familiar scent reached his nose, the unmistakable smell of smoke. At first, it was barely noticeable, like someone had lit a cigarette somewhere down the hall. But before he could think much of it, the fire alarms blared, echoing loudly through the building. Panic erupted as people bolted from their offices, grabbing anything they could. It took Ethan a moment to grasp what was happening, but the growing sound of frantic footsteps and the stench of burning plastic jolted him into action. He turned to the conference room's glass windows, and through the reflection, he could see a flickering orange glow creeping along the hallway walls. "Everyone get out!" someone yelled, and without thinking, Ethan grabbed his briefcase, instinctively clutching what little he could. The heat was suffocating as he joined the stampede toward the emergency exits. Thick smoke poured into the air, clouding his vision and filling his lungs. He coughed violently, trying to cover his mouth with his sleeve. The chaos was overwhelming. People were shouting, pushing, scrambling for their lives as they raced down the stairs. The flames were close behind, licking at their heels with relentless hunger. Ethan's heart was pounding like never before, and for the first time in years, he felt a real gut-wrenching fear. Not the usual stress of business deals or financial losses, but a raw primal fear. The kind that makes you feel small and helpless. By the time he reached the lower floors, the smoke was unbearable. His legs felt heavy, his lungs were on fire, and his vision blurred. Just as he thought he couldn't go another step, he collapsed, falling to the ground, the world spinning in a haze of heat and smoke. Suddenly, he felt strong arms lift him off the floor. "Hang in there," a calm voice said, steady even amid the chaos. Ethan barely had the strength to open his eyes, but when he did, he saw the man who had saved him. The firefighter's helmet was pulled low, shadowing his face, but as they stepped outside into the fresh air, something about the man caught Ethan's attention. It was a scar, a long jagged line that ran from his temple down to his jaw. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was the exact same scar his brother Daniel had from an accident years ago. It had been 18 years since Daniel vanished, 18 years since Ethan last saw that scar. Confusion and disbelief flooded his mind. Could it be? "Are you all right?" the firefighter asked, pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. His voice was deep, steady, without a hint of recognition. "Yeah," Ethan managed, his voice hoarse though his lungs still burned. "Thank you." The firefighter nodded, then turned to leave, but Ethan, still reeling from the shock, grabbed his arm. "Wait, what's your name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man hesitated, then answered, "Jack." And just like that, he disappeared into the crowd of firefighters and paramedics rushing to the scene. Ethan stood there, staring after him, his mind racing. The resemblance was uncanny, the scar, the eyes, even the way Jack moved. But how could it be? Daniel had vanished after the fire at their family farm all those years ago, presumed dead. No one had heard from him since. Shaking his head, Ethan tried to clear the fog of disbelief. He was probably just imagining things, the result of shock and the near-death experience. But something deep inside him refused to let go of the thought. He had to know more. As fire trucks and ambulances flooded the scene, Ethan stood off to the side, his mind in overdrive. The chances of this being his brother were slim to none, but the fire and that scar, it was too much to ignore. 4 years, he had searched for closure about Daniel's disappearance. Now, in the most unlikely of circumstances, a new possibility had opened up. Could Jack, the firefighter, really be his brother? Or was this just an impossible coincidence? For the rest of the day, Ethan couldn't focus on anything else. The faces of his business partners, the voices of his colleagues, they all faded into the background as his thoughts kept circling back to Jack. The scar. The past he thought he'd buried. The day Daniel disappeared had been the worst of Ethan's life. The wound it left never fully healed. And now it felt as though someone had ripped it open again. He couldn't ignore it. He needed answers. And deep down, Ethan knew he wouldn't stop until he found them. That night, sitting alone in his Manhattan penthouse, Ethan gazed out at the sparkling lights of the city below. Normally, this view helped him unwind after long days filled with high-pressure business deals. But tonight, his mind was far from the world of profits and contracts. He couldn't stop thinking about Jack the firefighter, and that scar. The more Ethan thought about it, the more convinced he became. It wasn't just the scar. It was the way Jack carried himself. The look in his eyes. It was so familiar, like a distant memory suddenly reigniting. He couldn't shake the image of his brother Daniel, frozen in time from all those years ago. They had been inseparable as kids, spending long carefree summers on their family farm outside Dallas. But everything changed that one fateful night. Ethan had been 22, fresh out of college, full of ambition. Daniel was still just a teenager, barely 16, full of rebellion and anger. They'd fought about something Ethan couldn't even remember now. What he did remember, though, was the aftermath, the fire that destroyed their family farm. A fire that no one could explain. And that night Daniel disappeared. The authorities searched for weeks, but there was never a trace of him. Ethan's parents were devastated, and Ethan carried the weight of guilt for years. He wondered if their fight had driven Daniel away, or worse, if his brother had perished in that fire. 18 years of guilt. It had never fully gone away. But now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, and that hope terrified him. Ethan grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts, eventually finding the number of a private investigator he had worked with a few years ago. Anthony West was one of the best in the business. An expert at digging up information on anyone, no matter how well hidden it was. Ethan stared at the number for a moment, his thumb hovering over the call button. Was he really about to do this? Could it really be possible that Jack was Daniel? The idea seemed insane, yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something to it. Something worth investigating. After a moment's hesitation, he pressed the button. Ethan? Long time no talk. Anthony's voice came through after a few rings, casual but with that professional edge. I need your help with something unusual, Ethan said, pacing restlessly across the room, unable to stay still. He quickly explained the basics: the fire, the firefighter, the scar. He left out the emotional weight of it all, not wanting to sound irrational. But Anthony had known him for long enough to recognize when something was serious. I'll see what I can find, Anthony replied. Send me what you've got on this guy. His name? Any details you remember? I'll get started. Ethan ended the call, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew that Anthony was his best shot at uncovering the truth. The next morning, Ethan woke with a heavy sense of anticipation. He had no idea how long it would take Anthony to get back to him, but waiting had never been one of his strong suits. He spent the day in meetings, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying memories of Daniel, their childhood together, and that fateful night when everything had changed. He remembered how Daniel had always looked up to him, following him around, asking endless questions. Ethan had always been the responsible one, the one with a plan and a vision for the future, while Daniel had been more carefree and willing to take risks. What haunted Ethan, though, was the anger Daniel had seemed to carry in the months before he vanished. The guilt of not being able to make things right between them had never fully left him. By the afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from Anthony. Meet me at my office. I've got something you'll want to see. Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He practically sprinted to the elevator, the ride to Anthony's office feeling like an eternity. When he finally arrived, Anthony was waiting with a folder in hand and a serious expression on his face. Tell me you found something, Ethan urged, unable to hide the impatience in his voice. I did some digging on Jack, Anthony said, nodding as he motioned for Ethan to sit. The guy's clean, at least from what I can tell, but there are some gaps in his history. He was adopted around the same age your brother disappeared. Ethan's stomach dropped. This was the kind of detail he had both hoped for and feared. I can't confirm anything yet, Anthony continued. But it's strange. Jack was adopted by a family in upstate New York, but there's almost no record of his life before that. No birth certificate, no details on where he came from. It's like he just appeared. Ethan leaned forward, his mind racing. You think it's possible? Anthony shrugged. It's possible. But we'll need more than this to be sure. If you want to get to the bottom of this, you'll have to dig deeper. I'll track down his adoption records, see if there's anything else that connects the dots. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. This was bigger than he'd expected, and it was about to get a lot more complicated. Leaving Anthony's office, Ethan felt a mix of excitement and dread. The information he'd received wasn't definitive, but it was enough to keep him on edge, feeding that small stubborn flicker of hope he hadn't been able to shake. Jack's adoption at the right age. The mysterious gaps in his history. It all seemed too coincidental to ignore. Back in his apartment, Ethan paced, trying to piece it all together. His mind raced through 100 possibilities. If Jack was really Daniel, how had he ended up in New York? Why had he never come back? And most pressing of all, why couldn't Jack remember? Sitting at his desk, Ethan opened his laptop and began typing. He wanted to know more about Jack before jumping to any conclusions. Researching people had always been second nature to him, and it didn't take long to find the local fire station where Jack worked. The website listed its staff, and sure enough, there was Jack. Full name: Jack Carter. The name didn't ring any bells, but the face. Ethan's stomach clenched as he stared at the photo. That was him. The man who had pulled him from the fire. Ethan scrolled further, trying to find more details. There wasn't much, just a brief bio mentioning Jack's background, his adoption, and his time with the department. But it was something about the way his eyes looked in the photo that caught Ethan's attention again. The more he stared, the more convinced he became that Jack could be his brother. But could he confront him again? Jack had already denied any connection to Daniel, and Ethan had to admit the idea sounded insane. How do you walk up to someone and tell them you think they're your long-lost brother, thought to be dead? Ethan shook his head, trying to focus. He needed more than just a hunch and a gut feeling. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Anthony. I'm pulling some records, but adoption files can be tricky to access. It might take a few days. Ethan sighed. Waiting was the last thing he wanted to do, but he knew Anthony was right. Adoption records were sensitive, and if Jack had been adopted under unusual circumstances, it might take even longer to uncover the truth. Still, Ethan couldn't just sit idly by. He'd never been good at waiting. Then a thought struck him. If Jack really was Daniel, maybe there were people in his life who knew more about his past, people who might have seen him grow up, who could know things Jack himself didn't remember. It was a long shot, but it was worth exploring. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed the fire station. His heart raced as he waited for someone to pick up. After a few rings, a woman answered. Station 28, how can I help you? Hi, Ethan said, his voice a little more nervous than he intended. I was hoping to speak with one of your firefighters. Jack Carter. Is he available? There was a pause, and Ethan held his breath. Jack's out on a call right now, the woman replied. But I can leave a message for him. Is this about something specific? The woman on the phone asked. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't really planned this part. No. That's okay. I'll try again later. Thanks. He hung up, frustration bubbling up inside him. Maybe this wasn't the right approach after all. But before he could dwell on it, another idea came to him. If Jack wasn't available, maybe someone else at the station knew more about him. The next day, Ethan decided to visit the fire station in person. It was a bold move, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency. The closer he got to the truth, the more pressing it became. When he arrived at Station 28, the building seemed quiet. A couple of fire trucks were parked outside, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air. Two firefighters were lounging near the entrance, chatting casually. Ethan straightened his jacket, feeling slightly out of place in his designer clothes among the worn uniforms and rough around the edges men. One of the firefighters noticed him and walked over, giving him a friendly nod. Can I help you? Yeah, I'm looking for Jack Carter, Ethan said, keeping his tone casual. I wanted to thank him personally. He pulled me out of a fire a few days ago. The firefighter smiled. Yeah, Jack's a good guy. Saved a lot of people over the years. He's out on a call right now, but he should be back soon. If you want to stick around. Ethan nodded, trying to play it cool. Sure. I can wait. As he stood there, he looked around the building, taking in the framed photos on the walls. There were pictures of firefighters at various events, team photos, and charity runs. One photo caught his attention. It was of Jack, grinning with his arm around another firefighter, both holding a trophy for some department competition. Jack looked younger, more carefree, and a lot less burdened. A voice pulled Ethan from his thoughts. Hey, you're the guy from the fire, right? Ethan turned to see a broad-shouldered, middle-aged man walking toward him. His face was weathered, worn by years in the field. I'm Chief Davis, the man said, extending his hand. Heard Jack pulled you out. Hell of a thing. Yeah, he did, Ethan replied, shaking the chief's hand. I'm just here to thank him. It was a close call. The chief nodded, his eyes briefly studying Ethan. Jack's a solid guy. Quiet though. Doesn't talk much about his personal life. Hell, none of us even knew he was adopted until a couple of years ago. He keeps things pretty close to the chest. Ethan's heart skipped. Adopted? Yeah. Came upstate when he was a kid. His folks were older, passed away a few years back. Good people. Jack doesn't talk much about it though. He's not one to dwell on the past. Ethan's pulse quickened. The pieces were falling into place, but he still needed more. As he continued talking to Chief Davis, Ethan realized that confronting Jack again was becoming inevitable. He couldn't let this go, not now that he was so close. But he had to be careful. One wrong move and Jack could shut him out completely. Ethan left the fire station with a mix of excitement and dread. Chief Davis's words had confirmed his suspicions. Jack's past was shrouded in mystery, and the more he learned, the deeper the puzzle became. Jack didn't talk about his past, and it almost seemed like he didn't remember much about his childhood, like it had been wiped clean. Could it be possible that Jack didn't even know who he really was? The rest of the afternoon was spent sifting through the information he'd gathered. Jack's adoption, the missing years, the scar. It all pointed toward something bigger. Something Ethan couldn't ignore. He had been careful to keep his emotions in check, but now this was personal. This wasn't just about business. This was about family. A buzz from his phone broke his concentration. It was a message from Anthony. I found something interesting. You're going to want to see this. Meet me at the usual spot. Ethan grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure what Anthony had found, but he had a feeling it was the missing piece he had been waiting for. When Ethan arrived at the small, dimly lit bar where he and Anthony usually met, he saw the investigator sitting at a corner table with a manila folder in front of him. Anthony looked up as Ethan approached, his expression serious. Tell me you've got something, Ethan said as he sat down, urgency thick in his voice. Anthony slid the folder across the table. I've been digging through some old records, adoption files mostly. It wasn't easy, but I managed to track down some information about Jack's adoption. Ethan opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. His heart raced as he read through the details. Jack had been adopted at 6 years old by a couple in upstate New York. The records were sparse, but there was one glaring detail. There was no mention of his birth parents. In fact, there was almost no information about his life before the adoption. Anthony leaned in closer, lowering his voice. It's like he just appeared out of thin air, Ethan. No birth certificate, no records of where he was before the adoption. Just some vague details about him being found wandering alone near a small town upstate. Ethan's mind spun. What about the scar? Is there anything about how he got it? Anthony shook his head. No. But if he was adopted at 6 or 8, he could have had the scar when they found him. No mention of any specific injury. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. If Jack was really Daniel, then the gaps in his history made sense. His disappearance after the fire, the lack of official records. But why didn't Jack remember what happened in those missing years? Anthony studied him carefully before speaking again. Look man, I know this is personal for you, but you've got to be careful. If Jack doesn't remember, pushing him too hard could backfire. He's lived his whole life as someone else. Finding out he's been living a lie could mess him up. Ethan nodded, the weight of Anthony's warning sinking in. This wasn't just about finding his brother. It was about unraveling a life Jack had built. A life that might not survive the truth. Still, Ethan couldn't ignore the feeling that he was so close to something monumental. He had to keep going, but he knew he needed to be cautious. As Ethan left the bar, the cool night air of the city wrapped around him like a shroud. The weight of what he had just uncovered pressed down on him, making each step feel heavier. He knew what he had to do next. Ethan knew it was time to confront Jack again. But this time it couldn't just be about questions. He needed something concrete. Proof that would force Jack to face the possibility that everything he believed about his life might be a lie. The next day, Ethan called the fire station again, but Jack wasn't on duty. Frustrated but resolute, Ethan decided that if he was going to get any answers, he'd have to visit Jack at home. He needed to speak with Jack in a place where they could both be honest, away from the distractions of the station and the weight of work. It had to be a conversation where Jack wouldn't feel cornered or defensive. Anthony had already given him Jack's address, so it didn't take long to find it. As Ethan pulled up to the modest house in a quiet neighborhood, a rush of nerves hit him. What if Jack slammed the door in his face? What if he refused to listen? Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door. He knocked, then waited. A few moments later, the door opened to reveal Jack, wearing a worn t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from a shower. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Ethan standing there. "You again?" Jack asked, his voice a mix of confusion and irritation. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone calm and steady. "Please. It's important." Jack hesitated, his brow furrowing. Then he stepped aside, motioning for Ethan to enter. "Fine, but make it quick." Ethan stepped into the small, cozy living room. It was simple and unpretentious. Nothing like the life of someone who'd come from wealth and privilege. Jack motioned for Ethan to sit, but remained standing with his arms crossed over his chest. "Look, I don't know what you think you're going to figure out by showing up here," Jack said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I already told you, I don't know anything about your brother. I'm not him." "I get that," Ethan replied, trying to stay composed. "But you don't know everything about your own past either. I've been doing some digging and there are things that don't add up. You were adopted when you were 6, right?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Yeah." Ethan swallowed hard, knowing this was the moment that could change everything. "There are gaps in your history, things that don't make sense. You don't remember where you were before that, do you?" Jack's expression hardened. "What are you getting at?" Ethan pulled the manila folder from his jacket and placed it on the coffee table between them. "You don't remember because you weren't Jack Carter back then. You were Daniel Williams, my brother." For what felt like an eternity, the room fell into a thick silence. Jack stood frozen, staring at the folder on the table as though it might explode at any moment. His expression shifted from confusion to frustration, and then to something much closer to anger. "You've got to be kidding me," Jack muttered, shaking his head as he stepped back from the table, putting distance between himself and the bombshell Ethan had just dropped. "This is insane." Ethan could feel his heart racing, but he stayed calm. He had been expecting this reaction. After all, what he was suggesting wasn't just unbelievable. It was life-shattering. "I'm serious, Jack," Ethan said, leaning forward, his voice steady but urgent. "You've always felt like something was missing, haven't you? The gaps in your memory. The fact that you don't remember anything from before you were 6. Doesn't that bother you? Don't you wonder where you really came from?" Jack crossed his arms and looked away, refusing to meet Ethan's gaze. "Look, I've made my peace with it. My parents told me everything I needed to know. They took me in when I had no one, and that's all that matters." Ethan shook his head. "But what if they didn't tell you everything? What if they didn't know the whole story themselves?" Jack's jaw clenched, his frustration building. "I don't need to know. I don't want to know whatever happened before they found me. It's in the past. I've moved on." "But you haven't moved on," Ethan pressed. "You've just buried it." Jack turned and stared at him with fiery intensity. "You don't get to come into my life and tell me who I am. You don't know me." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure despite the rising tension. "You're right. I don't know you, not fully. But I knew Daniel. And if there's even the slightest chance that you're him, don't you think it's worth looking into?" Jack was silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. Ethan could see the conflict written all over his face. He was pushing hard, he knew that. But he couldn't stop now. Jack needed to hear this even if it was painful. Do you remember anything at all? Ethan asked, his voice softening. Any flashes? Any memories from before you were adopted? Anything that feels off? Jack ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long, frustrated sigh. I don't know, maybe. Sometimes I get these flashes. Nothing specific, just feelings. Like something's missing. But I figured it was normal. Lots of adopted kids feel like that, right? Ethan nodded slowly. Maybe. But what if those flashes are pieces of your past? Pieces of a life you can't remember because it was taken from you. Jack's face was unreadable as he turned to face Ethan. What are you saying? That I'm supposed to just accept that my whole life has been a lie? I'm not asking you to accept anything right now, Ethan replied, his tone even. All I'm asking is that you consider the possibility. Look at the facts. Look at the gaps in your past. Look at how everything seems to line up. Don't you want to know for sure? Jack's fist clenched at his sides, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might get up and storm out, slam the door on everything and refuse to listen. But instead, Jack took a long breath, sank into the chair across from Ethan, and rubbed his temples, as if trying to ease the weight of the conversation. You really think I'm your brother? Jack finally asked, his voice quieter now. Jack's voice was quieter now, almost resigned as he said, You really think I'm your brother? Ethan paused, taking in Jack's expression before answering. Yes. Ido. Jack leaned back, gazing up at the ceiling as though the weight of everything was finally sinking in. His mind seemed to be racing. What if you're wrong? What if this is all just crazy? Ethan's response was calm, but there was a sense of finality to it. Then we'll figure it out, but I don't think I'm wrong. Jack ran a hand over his face, clearly conflicted. I don't even know what to make of this. I'm not sure how to feel right now. I get it, Ethan said gently, his tone softer now. Believe me, I've been living with this question for years. I never thought I'd get answers either. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the same uncomfortable silence. It felt more like a pause. Jack seemed to be processing everything he had just heard, trying to make sense of the puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. Finally, Jack looked at Ethan, his expression a little softer. I'll think about it. But I can't promise anything. Ethan nodded. That's all I'm asking for. With a heavy sigh, Jack stood up and motioned toward the door. I think this conversation is over for now. Ethan grabbed the manila folder from the table, still feeling the weight of the moment. I'll reach out again. Take your time with this. I know it's a lot to process. Jack led him to the door, and they stood there for a moment without speaking. Ethan stepped outside, glancing back at Jack as the door closed behind him. It wasn't a breakthrough, at least not yet, but it was something. A small crack in the wall that Jack had built around himself. Maybe this was just the beginning. As Ethan walked to his car, another thought began to settle in the back of his mind, something he had been avoiding for a while. What did their father know? Ethan had spent years trying to piece together the events of that night, but there were too many unanswered questions. His father had always been secretive, and now many of his answers were buried with him. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there were still secrets buried in their past. Secrets that could explain why Daniel had disappeared, why their family had been torn apart. The truth might still be waiting to be uncovered, but getting there would mean confronting things he wasn't sure he was ready for. The next few days blurred together. Ethan threw himself back into his work, diving into meetings, closing deals, and making appearances. But even as he stayed busy, his mind couldn't stop drifting to Jack, to Daniel, and to the truth that seemed just out of reach. The meeting at Jack's house had left him restless, and the possibility that his brother might still be alive consumed him more than anything else. Each night, when the noise of the city quieted and the lights of Manhattan dimmed, Ethan would find himself sitting by the window, staring out at the skyline. Memories of Daniel as a child, always following him around the farm, asking questions, looking up to him, flooded his mind. Those simpler times seemed so distant now before the fire, before everything changed. For 18 years Ethan had wondered if he could have done something, anything, to stop Daniel from disappearing. And now, for the first time, he might finally have a chance to get answers. But Jack wasn't making it easy. Ethan understood that. Learning that your entire life was a lie would shake anyone to their core. Still, Ethan couldn't let it go. He needed closure. If Jack was really his brother, there were so many questions that needed answers. Answers that had been hidden for so long. Their father had lied about so much. It was late one evening when Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He glanced at the screen and felt his heart skip a beat. Jack. The message was short, but it made his stomach twist. We need to talk. Meet me at the station tomorrow noon. Ethan stared at the screen, the weight of the words sinking in. He didn't know what Jack was going to say, but the fact that Jack had reached out meant something. Maybe he had spent time thinking about it. Maybe he was ready to open up. The next day, Ethan arrived at the fire station a few minutes before noon. The air was crisp, the sun shining down from a clear sky. As he walked through the station doors, he could feel the familiar buzz of activity. Firefighters were prepping their equipment, talking to each other, laughing, but Ethan's focus was on one man, Jack. Jack stood at the back of the station, leaning against a fire truck with his arms crossed. His posture was tense, but there was something different in his expression, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. Ethan took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever was coming. He walked over to Jack, trying to gauge his mood. "Thanks for meeting me," Ethan said, attempting to break the silence. Jack didn't respond immediately. He just stood there watching Ethan carefully, as though trying to piece something together. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "I've been thinking about everything you said." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Jack let out a frustrated sigh and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to think. Part of me wants to believe you're just some guy who's lost his mind, but there's another part of me that wonders. What if you're right? What if there's something I don't remember? Something I need to know?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I get it. It's a lot to take in." Jack's eyes flashed with frustration. "It's more than that. You're asking me to question everything. Everything I've known about myself. About my entire life. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Ethan swallowed, his voice softening. "I can imagine. But I'm not doing this to mess with your life, Jack. I'm doing this because I think you deserve the truth. No matter what that truth is." Jack fell silent, his gaze drifting downward. The room felt heavy, like the weight of his thoughts had suddenly become too much to bear. Ethan could sense the turmoil Jack was wrestling with, the urge to hold on to the life he knew, and the undeniable pull of something deep inside urging him to uncover the truth. "I did some digging," Jack finally spoke, breaking the silence. "You were right. There are things about my adoption that don't make sense. Gaps in the story. My adoptive parents never really told me much about where I came from, and honestly I never pressed for answers. I didn't really want to know." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What did you find?" Jack exhaled deeply, his breath shaky. "Not much, but enough to know there's more to it than I was told. My parents always said they found me wandering alone in some small town upstate. The authorities picked me up. But there's no record of what happened before that. No one knows where I came from. No idea who I was before I showed up there." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. This was it. "That lines up with everything I found too, Jack. I really think you're Daniel. I think our father knew something he never told anyone. And I think that's why you were put up for adoption." Jack's eyes locked onto Ethan's, searching his face, looking for something. Answers maybe, or just some kind of confirmation. But why? Why would someone just give me away? Why would our father do that? Ethan paused, his throat tightening. "I don't know. But I think it's connected to the fire. There was more to that night than anyone ever told us. I've been looking into it, and there are so many unanswered questions." Jack shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "This is insane. My whole life I thought I was just some kid who got lucky, adopted by a good family, given a second chance. And now you're telling me that wasn't even real? That everything I've known is a lie?" Ethan placed a hand on the table, his voice gentle. "It was real, Jack. The life you've built is real. Your parents loved you. That's not a lie. But your past. It's part of you whether you remember it or not. And you deserve to know where you really came from." Jack stood there, motionless, staring at Ethan. The weight of everything was clearly pressing down on him. Ethan could see the anger, the frustration, and the confusion in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something shifting, something that told Ethan Jack was starting to accept that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't what he thought it was. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost resigned. So what now? You dig up more dirt on our father and hope it leads to some big revelation. Ethan shook his head, frustration creeping into his tone. No. I don't want to drag this out any longer than it has to be. But I think there are still answers out there. Answers we haven't found yet. And I'm going to find them. Whether you choose to be part of it or not. Jack looked away, his jaw tightening as he absorbed Ethan's words. I don't know if I can do this, Ethan. I don't know if I want to. Ethan nodded in understanding. You don't have to. But if you ever decide you want to know the truth, I'll be here. With that, Ethan turned to leave. Jack remained still, staring at the ground as the door closed behind him. As Ethan stepped outside, he felt the heaviness of the conversation settle over him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time he felt like they were making progress. Closer to the truth. Closer to the answers they'd both been searching for. And closer to the dark secrets their father had kept hidden all these years. The drive back to his apartment was a blur. Ethan's mind raced with everything Jack had said. There was no turning back now. Both of them were tangled in this web of secrets, and Ethan knew he had to keep pulling at the threads, no matter how deep the mystery went. Jack was starting to come around, but Ethan could sense the hesitation in him, the fear of losing the life he had built. Ethan understood that. If Jack really was Daniel, then the revelation would tear apart everything he knew, everything he had worked so hard to build. But there was no stopping now. They were too close. Later that night, Ethan found himself sitting at his desk, poring over the same documents, notes, and records he'd gathered over the past few days. He flipped through the adoption records again, looking for anything at all, that could tell him more about how Jack had come to live with the Carters. But the file was maddeningly vague, offering only the barest details of his adoption at age 6. No background, no birth records, just a name and a date. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, cutting through his thoughts. It was a message from Anthony. I dug up some old files on your father. Looks like he kept a lot of secrets. We should talk. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He quickly texted back. When? Tomorrow. My office, came the reply. Ethan set his phone down, his mind already racing. What had Anthony found? His father had always been a complicated man. Stern, secretive, obsessed with the family's reputation. But Ethan had never imagined his father could be involved in something as dark as Daniel's disappearance. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Anthony's office, his mind swirling with possibilities. Anthony was already sitting behind his desk, surrounded by stacks of files. He waved Ethan in, gesturing to an empty chair. I've been looking into your father's business dealings around the time your brother disappeared, Anthony said, flipping open a file. Turns out your old man was involved in some pretty shady stuff, Anthony said, flipping through a stack of papers. Real estate scams, financial manipulation, the kind of things you keep off the books. Ethan leaned forward, his stomach churning. What does this have to do with Daniel? Anthony nodded gravely. That's the thing. I found some correspondences, letters, notes, that sort of thing between your father and some pretty unsavory characters. They were talking about loose ends and protecting the family. This was happening around the same time Daniel disappeared. Ethan's heart pounded. What are you saying? My father had something to do with Daniel being taken away. It looks that way, Anthony said quietly, pushing a folder toward him. I found this too. Ethan pulled the letter from the folder, his breath catching in his throat. The paper was worn and old, the ink faint but still legible. And there, in his mother's neat handwriting, were the words that would shatter everything he thought he knew. Ethan, if you're reading this, then the truth has come out. I've carried this burden for years, but I couldn't let you or Daniel be hurt because of your father's mistakes. He made enemies, powerful ones, and they threatened to come after our family. I didn't know what else to do, so I gave Daniel away. It was the only way to protect him. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the rest. Your father arranged for Daniel to be adopted in secret. We told you he was lost in the fire, but it was all a lie.
I'm sorry, Ethan.
I never wanted it to be this way. But there were people after us. Dangerous people who would have done anything to get to your father. Giving Daniel away was the only way to keep him safe. The letter ended there abruptly, as if his mother hadn't been able to bear writing more. Ethan sat back, the letter slipping from his hands as his mind spun with the gravity of her confession. So it was true. Daniel hadn't just disappeared. He'd been given away to protect him from the enemies their father had made. Your mother knew the whole time, Anthony said softly, his voice filled with quiet understanding. She was trying to protect you both. But your father. He was more interested in protecting himself. Ethan couldn't breathe. All these years, his mother had carried this secret. She had protected Daniel, protected their family, while Ethan had been left to believe that Daniel was lost forever in the fire. But now everything had changed. Jack was Daniel. His brother had been alive all along, living a completely different life, unaware of who he truly was. Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing the room. I have to tell Jack. Anthony nodded. He deserves to know. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Jack was going to be devastated. The truth would crush him. It would shatter everything he thought he knew. The life he had built would collapse under the weight of this revelation. But Ethan had no choice. Jack had to know. They had been separated for too long. Now was the time to bring him back into the fold, even if it meant destroying the illusion Jack had lived with for years. That evening, Ethan drove to Jack's house, his heart pounding with every mile. He had the letter with him, neatly folded in his jacket pocket. He had gone over what he would say 100 times, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of what was about to happen. When he pulled up in front of Jack's modest home, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Ethan sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was it, the moment that would change everything. He knocked on the door, his hands slightly trembling. A few moments later, Jack opened it, looking surprised to see him. Ethan, what are you doing here? Jack asked, stepping aside to let him in. We need to talk, Ethan said, his voice steady, though his nerves were on edge. I found something. Jack frowned, sensing the seriousness in Ethan's tone. What is it? Ethan pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. This is from our mother. It's about you. About Daniel. Jack stared at the letter, his face tightening. You're serious? I am, Ethan said, handing him the letter. Just read it. Jack hesitated for a moment, then took the letter from Ethan's hands. He sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the page. As he read, his expression shifted. Confusion, anger, disbelief all at once. When he finished, he looked up at Ethan, his face pale. I don't believe this, Jack whispered, his voice trembling. She gave me away? She was trying to protect you, Ethan said softly, sitting across from him. Our father, he made enemies. She thought giving you away was the only way to keep you safe. Jack slammed the letter down on the table, his hands shaking with rage. She lied to me. They both did. Ethan's heart ached. I know it's hard. I know this is a lot to take in. But she thought she was doing the right thing. She was trying to protect us. Jack stood up abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. All these years I've been living a lie. And for what? To protect our father? He's dead now. None of this even matters anymore. Ethan watched him, feeling the intensity of Jack's anger and pain. It matters, Jack. Because it's the truth. You deserve to know who you really are. Jack turned to face him, his eyes burning with fury. And what am I supposed to do with this? Just accept that I'm Daniel Williams? The brother I never knew I had? That everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie? Ethan stood up, meeting Jack's gaze. I don't know, but we can figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone. For a long moment, Jack didn't say anything. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with the weight of everything that had been revealed. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice low. I don't know if I can do this, Ethan. I don't know if I can be Daniel again. Ethan nodded slowly. You don't have to be. But you deserve to know the truth. And I'll be here, whatever you decide. Jack stood motionless, gripping the back of the kitchen chair, his knuckles white as he tried to process everything. Ethan gave him space, knowing there was nothing more he could say to make it easier. The truth had been exposed. Now it was up to Jack Daniel to decide what came next. You expect me to just accept this? Jack finally demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. You expect me to believe all this? That my entire life everything I've known has been one big lie. Ethan took a steady breath, trying to keep his tone gentle but firm. I'm not asking you to accept it without questions. I know this is overwhelming. I'm just telling you what I found. What our mother wrote. You have a right to know. You deserve the truth even if it's hard to hear. Jack's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. The truth? The truth is that I've been living in a fantasy. A life built on false memories. And now you want me to believe that I'm someone else? That I'm Daniel. The way Jack spat out the name made Ethan flinch. For so many years he had longed for this moment, dreamed of it. The reunion with his brother, the end of the search. But now, as the truth started to settle, it felt nothing like what he had imagined. This wasn't a happy reunion. It was two people, both strangers to each other, grappling with the shattered remnants of a lost past. Ethan didn't back down. I know this is a lot to take in. I can't pretend to know what it feels like. But who you've been, the life you've lived, all of that is still real. Your memories, your relationships, they're part of you. But now you know where you came from. You have the right to decide what to do with that. Jack stood motionless, staring into space, clearly processing the flood of information. After a long pause, he shook his head. Decide? How do I decide what to do with this? With the wreckage of my life. Ethan's voice softened as he stepped closer. You don't have to decide right now. Take your time. Process it. But I want you to know something. Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere. I've been looking for you for years, Jack. You're my brother. And now that I've found you, I'm not leaving you to go through this alone. Jack's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, the anger and disbelief faded from his face, replaced with something much heavier, acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. He had been Daniel Williams once, but that name felt alien to him now. The memories that had been buried for so long were starting to surface in fragmented flashes, like a dream just out of reach. I don't even know who Daniel is anymore, Jack muttered, his voice low. I don't know how to even begin to be that person again. Ethan moved closer, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. You don't have to be him. You've been Jack for a long time and that's okay. But you deserve to know the full story to fill in the gaps. The truth is yours to take. But you don't have to do it alone. Jack's mind seemed to be racing, his thoughts trying to pull together the pieces of a life that had been forcibly torn apart. The identity he had built, the life he had fought for. Everything was now clouded by this revelation. But one thing remained clear, the bond between him and Ethan, the undeniable truth that they were brothers. After what felt like an eternity, Jack spoke again, his voice steadier but still heavy. So what now? What do we do with all of this? Ethan sighed with a small measure of relief. I think we need to understand more about what happened back then. About why Dad did what he did, why everything was kept secret. There are still too many unanswered questions, the fire, the adoption, the lies. We need to start there. Jack's eyes darkened. You think there's more to the story? More than just a father trying to cover his tracks? Ethan nodded slowly. Ido. Our father wasn't who we thought he was. He made enemies, and I think you were caught in the middle of something much bigger than either of us realized. Jack's jaw tightened, the anger flaring up again. So, what you're telling me is that my father sold me out because of some shady deal. Or maybe because he was in over his head. He just tossed me aside like some commodity. Ethan's voice was calm but unwavering. I don't know all the details yet, but I believe he was trying to protect you. There's something dangerous at play here. Mom's letter said she agreed to send you away to keep you safe. She was scared for your life. Jack shook his head, his thoughts spiraling. It doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they just tell me? Why lie about everything? Maybe they thought they were keeping you safe by keeping you in the dark, Ethan suggested. Or maybe they thought it would be easier for you to grow up without knowing the truth. Jack's hands gripped the edge of the counter, his mind still wrestling with the lies that had shaped his entire life. Every part of him wanted to reject what Ethan was saying, to push it all away, but deep down the truth was undeniable. The pieces fit together too perfectly to ignore. Yeah, I need time, Jack finally said, his voice strained. I need to figure this out. Ethan nodded. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Jack looked up, his expression still tense but softer now, touched by a sliver of understanding. He didn't know how to rebuild his life, how to piece together an identity that had been stolen from him. But for the first time he didn't feel completely alone. As Ethan left Jack's house that evening, a mix of emotions churned inside him. Relief that the truth was finally out in the open, yes, but also a profound sadness for everything Jack had lost. The brother he had known was gone, replaced by a man who had lived his whole life in the dark. It would take time. More time than either of them could anticipate, probably. But for now, at least they had each other. And that was a start. For the next few days, Ethan kept his distance, respecting Jack's need for space. He knew that pushing too hard too fast would only drive him away. Jack needed time to absorb everything, to understand that his entire life, everything he thought was real, had been built on a lie. You expect me to just accept this? Jack finally asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. You expect me to believe that everything I've known, everything I've lived, has been nothing but a lie? Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I'm not asking you to accept it right away. I know this is a lot to process. I'm just telling you what I found, what our mother wrote. You deserve to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Jack's laugh was bitter, almost hollow. The truth? The truth is I've been living in a fake reality. A reality I built with false memories. And now you want me to believe I'm someone else? That I'm Daniel. Ethan winced at the sound of the name on Jack's lips. For so long he had imagined a joyful reunion with his brother. But now that the truth was out, it felt more like a collision of two worlds. The man sitting next to him, grappling with his identity, wasn't the brother Ethan had imagined. This was a stranger, trapped in a life he never asked for. I know it's hard, Ethan said, his voice steady. But you're still you. The life you've lived, the man you've become, those things are real. You've made a life for yourself. And I'm not asking you to give that up. I just want you to know the full picture, to know where you came from. And from there you can decide what happens next. Jack sat there for a long moment, his gaze unfocused. Then he shook his head, a wave of frustration sweeping over him. I've been trying to remember. Trying to dig up anything from my childhood. Anything that connects me to Daniel. But it's all like fragments. Pieces of a dream that don't make sense. Ethan felt a knot form in his chest. He had heard the struggle in Jack's voice, but hearing it so plainly made the reality hit harder than before. What do you remember? He asked quietly. Jack took a long breath, his face reflecting the weight of his effort. Not much. Just flashes. I remember a house. A big house surrounded by fields. I remember running through the grass. There was this old swing. I can still see it, but I don't know where it was. And I can hear a man's voice calling to me. But the words don't come clear. It's all muddled, like something I saw but can't fully grasp. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. That sounds like our family's farm, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a swing near the barn. We used to run through those fields all the time. Jack's brow furrowed as he processed Ethan's words. That's the thing. Feels familiar, but it doesn't feel like my life. It's like I'm watching someone else's memories, but I can't remember what's real. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. It makes sense. You were so young when everything happened. After the fire, you were sent away, your whole world was uprooted. It's no wonder the memories are fractured. But they're still there, Jack. You haven't forgotten everything. Jack's frustration flared, and he ran his hand through his hair. It's just so damn frustrating. I want to remember. But at the same time I don't. Part of me doesn't want to be that kid from the past. I've built a life as Jack Carter. I don't know how to be Daniel Williams. Ethan felt a deep empathy for Jack. He understood the internal tug of war. How difficult it must be to reconcile the life you've made with the shadow of a past you never knew. You don't have to become someone else, Jack, he said gently. You're still you, whether you're Daniel or Jack. The person you've become is real. But now you deserve to know the truth, the whole story. That's all I'm asking. Jack looked down at his hands, clenched into fists, his frustration barely contained. And what about our father? He asked, his voice strained. What was his part in all this? Why did he do this? Why did he send me away? Ethan hesitated, his words heavier now. That's something I'm still trying to piece together. There's more to our father than we realized. He made enemies, people who would do anything to get to him. Mom thought giving you away was the only way to keep you safe. Jack's face twisted in anger. Safe? You call this safe? I grew up with no idea who I was, no clue where I came from. They took everything from me. Ethan's heart ached at Jack's words. I know, Jack. And I can't imagine how hard that must have been. But I don't think they did it to hurt you. I think they thought they were protecting you. Jack fell silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the weight of everything settling between them, the missing pieces, the unanswered questions, the years of separation. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter now, more resigned. I don't know what to do next, Ethan. I don't know how to move forward from this. Ethan placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, his voice low and steady. You don't have to figure it all out at once. We can take it one step at a time. There's no rush. But I want to keep digging into what happened with Dad. I think there's more we haven't uncovered yet. And I think understanding it will help both of us make sense of everything. Jack nodded slowly, his expression still conflicted, his thoughts clearly torn. I just don't know if I can handle it. Ethan's voice remained calm and supportive. You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure it out together. For the first time since their conversation began, Jack turned to look at Ethan, his gaze softening just slightly. All right. Let's see where this leads. But I'm not making any promises. Ethan exhaled quietly, relieved that Jack was willing to take the next step, even if it was small. The road ahead would be difficult, and the truth would change everything for both of them. But at least they were no longer alone in it. Ethan felt a sense of relief wash over him. That's all I'm asking. The two brothers sat in silence for a few more moments, the weight of their shared history starting to settle between them. Though there were still so many questions unanswered, it felt like they were finally moving in the right direction together. As the sun sank lower, casting a warm golden light over the park, Ethan knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be long and fraught with challenges, but at least now he didn't have to walk it alone. As the days passed, the weight of their past continued to loom over both of them. The air grew cooler, and the nights seemed longer, filled with unspoken tension. Though their conversation had opened a door, it was unclear what lay beyond it. The truth that Jack was, in fact, Daniel Williams lingered in the background like an unacknowledged presence. But neither of them was quite ready to fully embrace it. For the next few days, Ethan dove deep into the investigation of their father's murky past. Jack, meanwhile, kept to himself, wrestling with the idea of confronting the life he had left behind, whether he was ready to or not. Their communication remained sparse, a series of short, clipped messages exchanged, neither one ready to dive into the emotional whirlwind that would follow revisiting the fire and the life after. Ethan spent long hours digging through old records with Anthony's help. They unearthed shady real estate deals, financial manipulations, and a handful of threatening letters from nameless enemies. It all painted a clearer picture of their father's involvement in dangerous circles. Daniel's disappearance wasn't just a tragic accident. It had been the collateral damage of something far bigger. But one question continued to haunt Ethan. Why had their father chosen to give Daniel away instead of finding another solution? And what was it that their mother hadn't told them? Was there more to the story beyond what was written in her letter? One evening, after a particularly long day of searching for answers, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from Jack. Come over tomorrow. We need to talk. Ethan's pulse quickened. Jack was ready for another conversation. Ethan didn't know if this would be the moment Jack fully accepted his identity as Daniel. But it was a step forward, and that was enough for now. The next morning, Ethan drove to Jack's house, his thoughts a mixture of hope and anxiety. When he arrived, he saw Jack standing on the porch, his face calm but serious. Ethan got out of the car and walked up the steps. He could feel something significant was about to happen. Thanks for coming, Jack said, stepping aside to let him in. No problem, Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. What's on your mind? Without wasting time, Jack motioned for Ethan to sit at the kitchen table. He took a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Jack began, his voice quieter than usual. About the truth, about our father, about everything. Ethan nodded, waiting for him to continue. I realized something, Jack said, his eyes avoiding Ethan's. I don't want to be Daniel Williams. Ethan's heart dropped. He had anticipated this might be a possibility, but hearing it aloud hit harder than he expected. What do you mean? Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, trying to understand. Jack rubbed his hands together, his eyes fixed on the table. I've spent the past few weeks trying to remember who Daniel was, trying to connect with this person you've told me about, but I just can't. I don't want to be him. I can't be him. Ethan's chest tightened, a wave of sadness crashing over him. You don't have to give up your life as Jack. You've built a life. I'm not asking you to throw that all away. Jack shook his head, his jaw tightening. It's not that simple. You don't understand. Daniel is just a ghost. A person I don't know, someone I can't remember. I've spent years creating a life as Jack Carter. And it's a good life. I have a job I love, friends who care about me. I don't want to dig up the past anymore. I don't want to be haunted by it. Ethan leaned forward, speaking softly. I get that, Jack, I really do. But the past is part of who you are. Whether you want it to be or not. You don't have to live as Daniel, but you can't ignore the truth. Jack stood up suddenly, pacing the room with an agitated energy. That's the problem, though. I don't know if I can live with this truth. I don't know if I want all the answers anymore. I've seen what digging into the past has done to you, how it's consumed you. I don't want that for myself. Ethan felt the sting of Jack's words, but he couldn't ignore the truth in them. He had been consumed by the search for Daniel, driven by the need to uncover everything. And now that he had found answers, the relief he had anticipated was nowhere to be found. It had only raised more questions, more pain. I'm not trying to drag you into the past, Ethan said, standing up to face Jack. I just want you to know where you came from. I want you to have the choice to understand the full picture. Jack turned to him, his eyes hard. And what if I don't want that choice? What if I don't want to keep digging? I've spent years as Jack Carter. That's who I am. I don't want to be Daniel. I don't need to be. Ethan's chest tightened as the weight of Jack's decision hit him. But you are Daniel. Whether you accept it or not. Jack slammed his hand on the table in frustration. I don't want to be. Don't you get it? I've lived my life without Daniel and I'm fine with that. I don't want to be dragged back into that world. I've moved on. Ethan stared at him, stunned into silence. The weight of Jack's words was like a punch to the gut. All these years, Ethan had been waiting for this moment, hoping to bring his brother back into his life. But now, faced with the reality of it, he realized Jack didn't want to be found. He didn't want to go back to being Daniel. So what are you saying? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper, his heart sinking. Jack ran a hand over his face, his frustration giving way to exhaustion. I'm saying I need to let go of the past. I need to live my life as Jack. I can't be someone I don't remember. I don't want to be. Ethan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. Jack had made his choice. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't sure where to go from here. Ethan paused, looking at Jack, his voice tinged with uncertainty. And what about us? What about being brothers? After everything? Can we still be that? Jack's face softened for a moment, and he sat back down, meeting Ethan's eyes directly. We're still brothers, he said, his voice steady. That doesn't change. I'm not walking away from that. But you have to understand I need to move forward as Jack. That's who I am now. I can't be Daniel again. I can't go back to something I don't remember. Ethan felt the weight of Jack's words, a mixture of sadness and acceptance sweeping over him. Jack had the right to choose his path, no matter how different it was from the one Ethan had envisioned. I understand, he replied softly, nodding slowly. I respect your decision. But I just don't want to lose you again, Jack. A small, tired smile tugged at Jack's lips. You won't lose me. But we'll do this my way. We'll figure it out together. But on my terms. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a strange blend of relief and sorrow. Okay. I can live with that. For a few moments they sat quietly, the tension between them easing as the silence grew more comfortable. It wasn't the perfect resolution Ethan had hoped for, but it was a step forward. They were still brothers, connected by blood and shared history. even if the past was too painful to fully embrace. After what felt like a long stretch of silence, Jack spoke again, his voice softer. What's next? About Dad. About everything you've been digging into. Ethan thought for a moment, exhaling slowly. I'm not sure. There's still a lot we don't know. A lot that doesn't make sense. But I've uncovered enough for now. Maybe it's time to let it go for a while. Jack nodded, his eyes looking distant as he processed the idea. Maybe that's for the best. We can't change the past, can we? No, Ethan agreed. But we can change how we move forward. Jack's face softened, a hint of peace in his expression. Yeah, I think it's time we do that. The decision had been made. Jack had chosen his own path, and Ethan had to respect that. The years of searching, of longing for a reunion, had culminated in a bittersweet moment. But for Ethan, it was enough to know that Jack, in whatever form, was still his brother. As Ethan drove away from Jack's house that day, a strange sense of closure began to settle in. It wasn't the outcome he'd imagined. He had spent so long holding on to the idea of reuniting with Daniel, hoping to put the family back together. But now he saw the truth more clearly. Jack had built a life for himself as Jack Carter. A life that had been carefully constructed and carefully protected. And now, as much as Ethan wanted to drag him back into their family's past, he understood that Jack had already moved on. A week passed with little communication between them. Ethan returned to his work, focusing on business as usual, but the distraction wasn't enough to fully quiet his thoughts. The lingering questions about the fire, their father's past, the people who had wanted him to fail, these things still haunted him. But a part of him had come to terms with not having all the answers. Some things he realized were better left in the past. One afternoon, as Ethan sat at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jack. Hey, I've been thinking. Let's grab a drink sometime soon. A smile tugged at Ethan's lips as he quickly replied. Absolutely. Let me know when. It wasn't much, but it was a sign. Their relationship, though changed, wasn't lost. They would find a way to be brothers again, even if it wasn't in the way Ethan had once imagined. A few days later, Ethan met Jack at a quiet bar in a more relaxed part of town, far from the business districts where he usually spent his time. This wasn't about work. This was about finding some new footing in their relationship. Jack was already seated when Ethan arrived, nursing a beer, lost in thought. When he saw Ethan approach, he offered a brief nod and a slight smile. Glad you could make it, Jack said as Ethan sat next to him at the bar. Wouldn't miss it, Ethan replied, signaling for a drink of his own. For a while they talked about everything and nothing. Work, the weather, the occasional bit of small talk that brothers should have been able to share over the years but hadn't. It was awkward at first, navigating the empty space between them. But as time passed, it began to feel right. They were both trying to adjust, to find their place in this new reality of being brothers once more. Eventually, the conversation turned back to what had brought them together in the first place. I've been thinking about what you said, Jack began, glancing over at Ethan. About Dad. About everything. Ethan nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. Yeah. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bar. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why he did what he did. Why he kept everything so secret, why he sent me away. But I've started to realize something. I can't let that define me. He made his choices. I have to live with that. But I can't carry his mistakes anymore. Ethan felt a sense of pride swell in his chest as he looked at Jack. He may not have embraced being Daniel, but Jack had finally accepted who he was, and that was enough. You're right, Ethan said quietly. We don't have to carry his mistakes. We're our own people now. You don't have to live in the shadow of what he did. Jack nodded slowly, as if the weight of those words was still sinking in. I'm not ready to dig any deeper. I don't think I'll ever be. But I'm not running from it anymore. I can accept that Daniel was a part of me. But I'm Jack. That's who I am now. Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. I understand. And I respect that. I'm just glad you're here, that we found each other. Even if it's not the way I imagined. Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. Yeah, life doesn't always go the way we plan, does it? They both laughed, the tension finally easing. As they clinked their glasses together, Ethan realized that this wasn't the perfect reunion he had dreamed of for so long. But it was real. They were real. Jack had chosen his path, and Ethan would walk alongside him wherever that led. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that, despite the past, they could move forward. Hope that they could create something new from the broken pieces of their past. When it was time to leave, Jack stood up and clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "I'm glad we did this. Let's not wait so long next time." "Agreed," Ethan said, smiling. "Take care of yourself, all right?" Jack gave a quick nod before heading out into the cool night. Ethan watched him walk away, feeling a sense of closure that had eluded him for so long. The truth had been revealed, the mystery solved. But life, as it always does, had taken unexpected turns. As Ethan drove home, he realized that the past, with all its secrets, was behind him. Jack had chosen his own path, and Ethan would walk beside him, no matter where it led.